A deep dive into the psychology of addiction. Addiction is one of the most complex phenomena in human psychology, acting as a bridge between biological necessity and behavioral pathology. While society often distinguishes between substance addictions, like alcohol and nicotine, and process addictions like gambling, pornography, or compulsive buying, the human brain makes no such distinction. At a fundamental level, addiction is a chronic dysfunction of the brain's reward, motivation, and memory systems. It is not a failure of character, but rather a sophisticated hijacking of the very mechanisms that evolved to keep us alive. To understand addiction, one must first understand the mesolimbic dopamine system. Evolution designed this system to reinforce life-sustaining behaviors, eating, bonding, and procreating. When we engage in these activities, the brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter that serves as a teaching signal, marking the experience as important and worth repeating. In the context of addiction, this system is overwhelmed. Substances like cocaine or nicotine cause a massive artificial flood of dopamine, while behaviors like compulsive buying or pornography consumption provide rapid-fire, novel hits of stimulation. This creates a reward deficit over time. The brain, seeking homeostasis, reduces its natural dopamine production and shuts down receptors, a process known as downregulation. Consequently, the individual loses the ability to feel pleasure from everyday activities, leading to the flat, emotional state known as anhedonia. The addict no longer uses to feel high, but simply to feel normal. The shift from impulsivity to compulsivity. The psychology of addiction is characterized by a tragic transition in the seat of cognitive control. In the early stages, usage is typically impulsive, driven by the pursuit of pleasure or the rush. This stage is governed by the ventral striatum, the area of the brain associated with immediate rewards. However, as the behavior becomes chronic, the neurological burden shifts to the dorsal striatum, which governs habit formation. At this point, the behavior becomes automatic, much like tying your shoes or driving a familiar route. This is why many people with addictions describe a dissociative state. They may find themselves mid-act, walking into a liquor store or opening a specific website, without having made a conscious, top-down decision to do so. The prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, becomes physically and functionally weakened, making it nearly impossible to just say no when the habit-driven lower brain takes over. Beyond the biology, addiction is often a profound, albeit destructive, attempt at self-regulation. Psychological theories such as attachment theory suggest that individuals who lack secure emotional foundations in childhood may turn to substances or compulsive behaviors as surrogate attachments. A bottle of alcohol or a shopping spree is reliable. It is always there, it does not judge, and it provides an immediate change in internal state. For many, addiction is a response to psychological pain. This is the self-medication hypothesis. A person struggling with social anxiety finds a social lubricant in alcohol. Someone feeling powerless in their personal life finds a temporary sense of agency through the acquisition of new goods. The tragedy of this coping mechanism is its cyclical nature. The consequences of the addiction, debt, isolation, health issues, create more pain, which in turn fuels the need for further medication. The psychology of addiction cannot be viewed in isolation from the individual's environment. In the 1970s, psychologist Bruce Alexander challenged the then-current view of addiction with his rat park experiments. He noted that rats in small, isolated cages would compulsively consume morphine until they died. However, rats in a park with toys, space, and social interaction almost never overdosed, even when morphine was readily available. This suggests that addiction is, in part, an adaptation to one's surroundings. In humans, dislocation, the loss of community, purpose, or social identity, creates a vacuum that addiction readily fills. Chronic stress, poverty, and social isolation change the brain's chemistry, making it significantly more vulnerable to the lure of a quick chemical or behavioral fix. Understanding addiction as a multifaceted psychological and neurological disorder changes the approach to recovery. Because the brain has learned the addiction so deeply, recovery is not merely about stopping a behavior. It is about neuroplasticity, the slow process of teaching the brain to find reward in healthy stimuli again. It requires repairing the prefrontal cortex through mindfulness and cognitive therapy, addressing the underlying trauma that necessitated the escape, and perhaps most importantly, building a human park of social connection that makes the addiction less necessary. To understand how we move from a choice to a compulsion, we have to look at the specific psychological triggers that turn everyday activities into process addictions. Unlike substances which have a clear chemical entry point, process addictions like compulsive buying, pornography, and gambling rely on the brain's internal chemistry to create a digital or behavioral drug. In process addictions, the high is often found in the anticipation rather than the acquisition. This is known as the appetitive phase of addiction. For a compulsive buyer, the trigger isn't necessarily the item itself, but the notification of a sale or the visual stimulus of a storefront. This cue triggers an immediate spike in dopamine, creating a state of wanting, incentive salience, that overrides the liking of the actual product. The slot machine effect. Many digital addictions use intermittent reinforcement. When a person scrolls through a feed or a shopping app, they don't find something they like every time. The unpredictability, the maybe this time, is what keeps the brain locked in a loop. Once the brain's reward system is primed, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, often begins to create rationalizations to lower the psychological discomfort, cognitive dissonance, caused by the behavior. Magical thinking. A gambler believes they have a system, or a compulsive buyer believes a specific purchase will fundamentally change their identity or solve their problems. Dissociation. During the act, binging a series, scrolling for hours, or spending, many individuals enter a trance-like state. Time seems to disappear. This is a psychological defense mechanism that blocks out the stress or anxiety the individual was trying to escape in the first place. The chasing phenomenon. After the behavior is over and the dopamine drops, it is replaced by a crash of guilt or shame. To escape this painful feeling, the individual returns to the behavior as quickly as possible, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Therapeutic models. Rewiring the brain. Treating these neurological shifts requires more than just stopping. Because the brain has been physically altered, therapy must address both the biology and the behavior. Cognitive behavioral therapy. This is the gold standard for process addictions. It focuses on identifying the specific triggers and automatic thoughts that lead to the behavior. By slowing down the moment between the urge and the action, patients can begin to rebuild the inhibitory control of the prefrontal cortex. Dialectical behavior therapy, often used when addiction is tied to intense emotional regulation issues. It teaches distress tolerance, the ability to feel a negative emotion, like boredom or sadness, without needing to immediately fix it with a compulsive behavior. Cue exposure therapy. This involves exposing the individual to their triggers in a controlled environment without allowing them to engage in the behavior. Over time, the brain learns that the cue, like a sale notification, does not have to lead to an action, the purchase. Unlike alcohol or drugs, you cannot simply quit buying things or using the internet forever. Therefore, the psychology of recovery in these areas is about reintegration. It involves moving from a reactive brain, one that jumps at every dopamine spark, to a reflective brain. This is achieved through consistent, healthy rewards that are slower and more meaningful, such as creative hobbies, physical exercise, and deep social connection.